Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ALMA 2020 webinar series. My name is Thad Gurley, and I will be moderating today's discussion on counterintuitive productivity. We like for our webinars to be interactive, so we urge you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar. Our webinar will address the questions at the conclusion of the webinar. Please use the question box on your GoToWebinar browser to submit questions. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but if we run out of time during the question answer session, I will forward any unanswered questions to the presenter. Additional resources for the webinar are located on the right side of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the ALMA website shortly following the webinar. I would especially like to thank our sponsors, Agilent and BioCare, for sponsoring our first webinar. Without their sponsorship, we would be unable to provide the webinar to our ALMA community free of charge. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Mark Kennedy. Mark Kennedy, PhD, has held various technical leadership positions at DuPont for over 32 years in the areas of environmental sciences, global registration and regulatory affairs, toxicology, and analytical sciences, working across agricultural, chemicals, materials, biologicals, and pharmaceuticals. He received his bachelor's degree from Duke University in chemistry and Russian language and literature, and his PhD in analytical chemistry from Purdue University. He has studied leadership through financial excellence through MIT Sloan Business School and family therapy through EB Theological Seminary. At DuPont, Mark became well known for his team building, coaching, and people engagement skills. His organization holding the highest possible employee engagement rating versus corporate benchmark. He has led organizations through mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, and spins, created high-functioning global teams, driven the value of diversity in the company, and led effective cultural change. At the end of 2018, he retired from DuPont to offer coaching and people engagement consulting more broadly. Mark is a certified professional coach and has worked with individuals across many different industries. His company, Sustainable Transformation LLC, provides individual professional leadership and life coaching, problem solving and business consulting, and also workshops designed to transform organizational thinking. Mark is currently also an adjunct professor of chemistry at Widener University and a proud member of the Pride. In his free time, he volunteers as a peer counselor at the William Way Community Center in Center City, Philadelphia, and enjoys being a father to his 2 sons. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Thad. Today I'm going to be talking about what I call counterintuitive productivity. And this comes out of my experience in 32 plus years at DuPont, plus my working with clients in my coaching business across a variety of organizations. There are 2 people that have also really influenced my thinking about this topic, and so I just want to give a shout out to both of them. One is Cy Wakeman. She refers to herself as a drama researcher, and you'll see some of her work in this presentation. And the other is Jennifer Garvey Berger, who's done a lot of work on mind traps, and you'll see some of her work in here as well. So today we're going to talk about what do I mean by counterintuitive, and we're going to briefly talk about the landscape of productivity and metrics, and then we're going to spend our time on managing moods and attention, slowing down for productivity, which is really going to be about active listening, and then facilitating good mental processes. So we're going to focus on people, much like this individual has taken a very counterintuitive approach to the sign behind it. So let's start with intuition. Intuition is something we know directly without analytical reasoning. It's kind of the bridge between the conscious and non-conscious parts of our brain. And Harvard Business School tells us that intuition works. And it works when we are experts in our business, which is good news for everybody on the call, and when we are deeply introspective. And sometimes this gets us into trouble because our habits and what we've been taught interfere with our intuition. So most of us, for example, pour liquids out of a box as depicted on the left-hand side, which is really not the most effective way to do it. In fact, the most effective way to pour liquids out of a box is depicted on the right-hand side. And much like our habits and what we've been taught, our organizations condition us to certain specific behaviors, and that interferes with our personal intuition. So when I talk about productivity, here are the kinds of things I hear from a variety of organizations. I'll hear things like, it's all about time management. So I would say that if it were all about time management, this would have been solved many, many years ago, because there are a zillion time management books, there are a zillion time management workshops, and everybody in an organization goes through at least one time management workshop in their career. Some organizations are very prescriptive. So when X happens, you do Y, and that's just what we do. Some organizations just work longer hours, work longer shifts in order to get productivity. And then, for example, others are like, do whatever you can, but, above all, avoid conflict. So you can see how those would sort of condition our behavior. Another part of this landscape is metrics and KPIs. And these are really intended to provide guidance and promote productivity and kind of keep the organization on target. But sometimes they feel like this to us. And so I see a lot of managers just agonize over metrics and KPIs. And so I briefly just want to say the time to agonize over these is when you're putting them in place, because you will get what you measure. So you should be very sure that you want what you're measuring. And there are lots of examples out there of things that people have gotten that they didn't really intend to get because of what they were measuring. But once they're put in place, unless it is really absolutely causing you to do the absolute wrong thing, it's not a battle worth fighting. It's just now part of the landscape. And so I tell most people, just accept it, and your energy is better put in other productive measures. And then the other piece is productivity itself. So we define this as the efficiency with which tasks and goals are completed for the organization. So when we want to increase productivity, or what's organizationally intuitive is that we tend to fix or improve a process. So the problem is this: most of our processes have been fixed and improved a dozen times by now. And so any fix or improvement, unless there's real step change technology out there that's going to make a significant difference, most of these are very sort of tweaks, very incremental changes, and you don't get a lot of additional productivity. In fact, I pulled up this word cloud for productivity, and it was fascinating to me, because this represents what's organizationally intuitive around productivity. And what's fascinating is that the word people doesn't appear anywhere in there. So I want to offer you a organizationally counterintuitive approach to productivity. And that is that managing moods and facilitating good mental processes with our employees is another option to increase productivity. So let's start with managing moods. So as background, there are two neural networks in the brain that are in competition with each other. One is called the task positive network, and the other is called the default mode network. And you can think of these as strings of holiday lights almost. When the red lights are on, the green lights are off. And as the green lights come on, the red lights go off. Same thing with these networks. The networks, as one network comes on, the other network goes off. The other thing in terms of background for these networks that's important to know is that the nomenclature is a bit unfortunate. So task positive sounds like we're working, so it sounds like a working neural network. Default mode sounds like it's somehow offline, but it actually uses the same amount of energy, the same amount of oxygen. It is, in fact, a working network, and it is just a different way for us to work. So we have two networks. We also, when we boil down all of our jobs, we basically have two jobs. We generate ideas and we implement them. And so the good news is that each of these networks is good at one of those things. The default mode network is really good at generation of ideas. The default mode network in our brain allows us to reflect and imagine and be creative and learn from the past and learn from others. And it's really where our aha moments come from. There's an individual that I really enjoy listening to. Her name is Ursula Pottinger, and she's with Be Above Leadership. And she refers to the default mode network as her team of wizards, because they're working in a way that is very nonlinear and almost magical to come up with new ideas. Once we have new ideas, we implement them with the task positive network, which Ursula refers to as her team of engineers, because they're doing and they're focusing and they're setting goals and planning and solving problems and learning from them. So we have two types of work, we have two types of networks. So what could possibly be the problem? So think about a time, probably any day this week, that you've been working on a task. And along about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you start having a lot of distractions. Your mind just starts to wander, right? And so you find yourself putting a lot more energy into staying focused on the task, and consequently less energy into the task itself. This also happens in long meetings. You're in a leadership team meeting for 4 hours. Along about hour 3, you find that you're just having a lot more trouble staying focused on what's going on in the meeting. You're putting a lot of more energy into that willpower to stay engaged. This is because we actually can't stay in either network for too long, or it just grinds us to a standstill. We really need to be able to switch between the task positive and the default mode network. So if we've been working on a task for hours, our brain will demand default mode time. And so we can use that constructively and switch to a task that's creative, so that we're really working with our mood. Or the brain will make that happen in a destructive way, like our minds wandering in a meeting. And so it's actually a false belief that productivity is associated with the task positive network, and that like somehow working 12 hours is going to be it's going to be a lot better than working 8 hours on a specific task. In fact, what happens is we hit a brick wall. We all know this. We hit a brick wall, we're exhausted, and there's no innovation left in us at all. So we really need to use both networks. So I would say that first, productivity is about mood and attention management, and we can help people move between, and we ourselves can move between these two neural networks. I'm going to give you a real example. I have a lot of these kinds of real examples. I had an individual who was working on a particularly difficult structural elucidation in the lab. And it was way more complex than any of us thought it was going to be. And it took a lot longer. And this individual had generated a lot of data, spent a lot of time and a lot of focus on this problem, and realized that he was kind of behind in time. Came to give me an update, and it was really clear that he was exhausted and he was struggling to figure out what the next step was, and he was frustrated. And so I said, well, you've been working really hard. It's a really nice day outside because it's very sunny. Go take a walk. And his response was, no, I really just need to push through on this and get this done. And I said, well, you've been in a lab without windows all day. You owe this to yourself. It'll help you clear your mind. Go take a walk. And reluctantly, he did. And we have a nice campus to walk around. So took a mile walk. And what happens during that walk? Well, what happened was his team of engineers that had been working so hard on this problem shut down. And his team of wizards started working on the problem. Because that is just a different way of working. And by the end of his walk, he had an aha moment about the problem and came back to the lab and spent another hour and a half in the lab and had solved this incredibly complex structural elucidation. And I would submit to you that had he just pushed through, he would have spent many, many, many more hours and maybe days working on this. And that the ability to actually switch to another network and let the work happen in that way for a while actually increased his productivity dramatically. So I encourage us to be more intentional about using both networks and encouraging our employees to shift between both networks. Now, sometimes it's more than just mood. It's actually about drama in the workplace. And so this is some of the research by Cy Wakeman. And she defines drama as unproductive thought processes, disruptive behavior, and wasted emotion. And here's what's fascinating. In her research, she has found that most employees spend an average of 2.5 hours per day in drama. And if you account for how much people actually work as opposed to the 40 hours a week we say we work, that's 816 hours per year per head count in drama, which is unproductive work in the workplace. On top of that, Richard Boyatzis has done a lot of work to prove something that we kind of know intuitively, is that the brain has an open loop system, and we're wired to pick up subtle clues from each other. So we could actually say that emotions are contagious. And so if you have someone spending a couple hours in drama a day, you probably have an entire group spending a couple of hours in drama a day. The good news is that leaders can collaborate with their employees to eliminate the drama waste and facilitate good mental processes. This is not only good for productivity, but it's good for people just feeling better about themselves and the work environment. Now, the drama can be kind of out in the open. So if it's group drama, it's like really obvious, and we all like feel like we don't want to have to deal with it, but we need to. But that's actually the easiest drama to deal with because it's very obvious. A lot of this drama is kind of locked up inside people, and they don't really vocalize it. And that's really where we can help people by encouraging them to share and to have better mental practices. So a lot of times managers will respond to drama in kind of a negative way. I look at drama, I think it's really important to take a positive view, and I really look at drama as a wake-up call, that there's something that wants to shift, there's something that wants to transform. I want you to notice the verb wants. It's a red flag that something wants to change, and really all I'm doing is trying to help it along to change. So this is how I think of it. I have sort of two cycles here. On the right-hand side, that's the individual cycle. That's the working one-on-one with people. And it starts with active listening. And I'm going to share with you that there's a little bit of, there are two things in my career in leadership that I found are a bit magical about leadership. And so anybody that's taken my my workshops on people engagement know that there are 5 things that I think people absolutely need to be engaged. But that underlying it, the key, sort of magical key to that is vulnerability. In the same way here, there are things people need to become more self-reflective and develop better mental processes. But the little bit of magic is active listening. And so if you can learn to become a better active listener, I guarantee you things will transform in your organization and productivity will increase, whether you do the rest of this or not. So the cycle starts with active listening and someone feeling truly and completely heard. And then at that point, we can start working with people to sort of rewind and reframe the stories that they tell themselves. And then moving into individual reflection, we continue around that cycle, and that ultimately reduces personal drama. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the left-hand side today, but I submit that when individuals in the group become self-reflective, the group as a whole eventually becomes more self-reflective because people become better listeners. People are more aware of the impact of their words, and that reduces the group drama. So let's talk about listening. We're going to spend some time on active listening. So typical listeners are more likely to interrupt and jump to conclusions. They're looking at their phones and listening at the surface, just kind of confirming data. They're either trying to prove they're right or prove you're wrong, or kind of scanning for threats on their social well-being in the organization, filtering for their interests and for things that are important to them, which is kind of the origin of that get to the point. But ultimately, it's about being unable to separate their own needs and interests from others. And so typical listeners are focused on self. Unfortunately, that means that people being listened to experience being cut off, they experience being ignored, they experience being misunderstood much more frequently than they experience being heard. And when we ignore others' thoughts and needs and feelings, basically what we do is objectify them. And we've all had this experience. We've all gone into our a one-on-one with our manager, and we're kind of excited. There are a couple things we want to share and we want to talk about, and we want to do a little brainstorming and make some suggestions. And we get to that meeting, and that manager has one thing that he or she is interested in that they need for themselves, and that's all they want to talk about. And when we're done talking about it, the meeting is done. And I don't know about all of you, but I come out of meetings like that feeling very de-energized, and it takes some energy to get energized again. And it's because I went through that meeting as an object in the meeting. So we're encouraged to listen to our hearts and our guts and our inner voices, but really rarely are we actually encouraged to listen carefully and purposefully to other people. So I want you to think about the last time at work, very important that this is at work, the last time at work that someone listened to you so attentively that you felt completely heard and absolutely understood. I've asked this question to a lot of groups, and typically the answers I get back are not within the last week or within the last month. The answers I get back are maybe within the last year, within the last 5 years. And I always get a few, I'm not sure that's actually ever happened. And that's a travesty, but it's also very much what many of our workplaces are like. So active listening is about taking time to fully understand another's point of view. So this, relating back to counterintuitive productivity, it's about slowing down to become more productive, which seems counterintuitive. So it's beyond hearing. It's how the person said what they're saying and what they're doing while they're saying it, and the context they're talking in, and what's resonating within you as they're talking. And so this kind of listening creates an awareness and a trust and an intimacy, but perhaps most importantly, it exudes presence. And many of our work environments are very chaotic, so it's hard to be present. But that presence is part of the magic of active listening. And so that deep listening then makes people feel important because they are important. I think there are 4 steps for active listening. At least this is how I approach it for myself. They are self-awareness, self-preparation, curiosity, and self-management. And there's a strong correlation between listening skills and the ability to access empathy. And it is the accessing empathy that allows people to feel truly heard. Of these 4 steps, self-awareness is the first, and without self-awareness, none of the rest of it happens. So unless we are willing ourselves to start the journey and make it a lifelong journey of self-awareness, we can't expect that anybody else will do this. We're going to talk about why that's so necessary. So when somebody tells us something, between our ear and our brain, we do a lot of filtering. We filter that message based on our beliefs and values. We filter that message based on our past experiences. We filter that message based on our cultural biases and so many other things. And so it's not unusual that what we hear is actually very different from what was actually spoken. And so this self-awareness is so important because it's what helps us manage our filters. It's what helps us tamp this down so that we can hear more exactly what was actually said. The other thing that self-awareness helps us with is mindset. So managers in particular often get pulled into one of these 2 mindsets. And I think they have very good intentions, but not always a good outcome. So one mindset is fixers. And I would submit that when we fix, we see life as broken. And so fixers see others as broken. The other mindset is helping. And when we help, we see life as weak. And so the helper may see others as weaker or needier. And so even though those are out of the best of intent, they tend to create distance between people. And so we're only really connected when we serve and when we're on the journey with the person as we're talking. And so we need to stay connected. So we're going to use self-awareness to manage our filters, to manage our mindsets. It's really about observing ourselves and becoming more conscious of our thoughts and our emotions and our behaviors. So people will ask me how to get started on that. In the lower left-hand side of the slide, there are a variety of ways that people work on self-awareness. That could be a whole day's workshop in itself. Fundamentally, though, what we're doing is beyond just our thoughts. We're paying attention to our emotions and what's going on in our body. And then I pay attention to what bothers me about other people, because there's usually self-awareness gold in there. If somebody gets under your skin, there is something that I need to learn about myself. And then I think everybody has some questions that continuously challenge their awareness. I'm not being prescriptive here. These are two that I use that are helpful for me. They may be very different questions for you, but I often ask myself to keep that self-awareness going. What is it that I cannot hear? And what am I feeling right now? So as we increase our self-awareness, it allows us to slow down. It allows us to become more aware of our thoughts, and so we can release those thoughts. It allows us to become more comfortable with silence. It allows us to focus on the person that we're listening to and release our judgments and release our self-interest and release our doubts. And all of this together increases our empathy, which increases the chance that the person that is talking to us is going to feel truly heard. Next step is self-preparation. So for me, this is an important step. This is right before the meeting. And because I think the meeting is about forgetting myself for a moment and letting go of my agendas and abandoning the need to prove anything or dominate the conversation or convert someone to my cause, which are all things we're taught to do in leadership, I really need to take that moment to get present and prepare for that conversation. It's only a few moments before the meeting, but here's what I do. And it's not intended, again, to be a prescription, but it's an example. I take a few deep breaths and be intentional about becoming present to create space for that conversation to happen. And then I remind myself that people are bright and are trying their best. And that is a fundamental belief I have, but saying it out loud to myself helps me create what I believe is the proper mindset for the meeting. And then out loud, I remind myself that there is always something new I can learn from anyone about any subject. And that also is a fundamental belief I hold. But saying it out loud helps me create an openness within the meeting. Then I think about positive things I appreciate about that person, particularly if we're likely to have what might be a contentious meeting. I want to generate positivity in myself, and I want to generate it specifically to that person. And then I reframe listening as a gift, because that's what I believe it is. And I'm doing it not so much because I want something, but because I care about the person. And I hope that by doing that form of self-preparation, a person will walk in and feel that they matter to me as a human being because they do. During the actual talk, the key word for me is curiosity. So we are focused on the speaker's spoken and unspoken words, but we're being curious about their feelings and their thoughts and their needs and their point of view. And we're expressing that curiosity with open-ended questions. So we're just trying to learn more about what they're feeling, what they're thinking, and not trying to guide them in any particular way. And we're listening to what was said and how it was said and what the values expressed are and what the beliefs expressed are. And we're replaying that for them so that they can affirm that we're actually hearing it correctly, or they can correct us if we're not hearing it correctly. I have 5 emojis on the side of the right-hand side of the screen, because the question I often get as I talk through this is, well, you're telling me to pay attention to emotions and to kind of play those back, and there are so many emotions, and that's so hard for me. So I'm going to try to make it easy for you and tell you that there are really only 5 basic emotions. So from top to bottom, they are happiness, sadness, shame, anger, and fear. And every other emotion is really just a degree of one of those. Every other word we have for emotion is a degree of one of those, or a combination of 2 of them. So if you can just look for one of those 5, it will make it much more simple. Human beings, the sentence at the bottom I think is really truly important. Human beings automatically alter their behavior to synchronize. We know this intuitively. We know it in ourselves. But the quality of the listener really lets the other be more present and at ease and authentic. The other thing that's really critical during the actual listening part of the meeting is silence. So you have to give people time to think and consider and let something arise within themselves. Something will emerge if you give it time and you don't step in with words to try to rescue them. So oftentimes what I'll tell people is when you want to say something, it's been quiet, you want to say something, that's when you start counting 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. And let yourself go to 10, 15, 20, 1,000 before you jump in and say anything. Because typically within that time, something will have emerged from the other person that would have gotten cut off and lost. And typically it's really very important that emerges. So let it emerge. I think one of the studies that really spells this out for me is a Journal of American Medical Association article about a busy clinic. And they did a study of medical doctors, and they found that doctors interrupt their patients with a diagnosis on average in 23 seconds. If they had waited, sorry, there's a typo, it should have been waited instead of wanted. If they had waited 6 more seconds, the patient would have revealed something that would have changed the diagnosis. And I think that really hits the point home of the importance of silence. And then also during the conversation, we're practicing self-management. So we may not control a thought, but we can control how we respond to the thought. So this is about when a thought comes to us, just acknowledging it and letting it go so that we can return our focus to the speaker. And that will happen over and over again. In fact, it's very much, I chose this image because it's very much like a meditation where a thought comes in, we acknowledge it, release it, and go back to our breathing or go back to our mantra. In this case, our focus is the speaker. And actually, personally, that's how I kind of know I'm in the zone with active listening, is that it feels like a meditation to me. I'm going to skip through this one because it's just more information about how you can deal with thoughts that come in. But overall, the result of an active listening process is people feel heard, they provide more information, more relevant details, more elaboration. It's a more open and honest conversation, and it builds a cooperative and a more productive relationship. And it does promote productivity in the work environment. An additional benefit is that people are actually more likely to listen to you because you're more likely to be able to deliver a message that resonates. So now we've spoken, we've listened, the person feels heard and understood. And at this point is where we could actually start, if necessary, the rewinding and reframing that will help that might help your employee feel happier and more energetic and kind of change the choices and actions that they make. So I'm going to give you an example. This is how people tend to work, right? We have an experience. We maybe have an emotion out of that experience as well as some stimuli in the experience. We make a story about it. And out of that story, we make a choice. And that choice results in an action of ours out in the real world, which generates an outcome or a result. And so the story, choice, action piece of that is the emotional and mental processes. And so they link directly to outcomes and results in the environment and in our work environments. And if we want to create more possibilities, we need to facilitate more productive mental processes, which means we need to slow down because most people operate on the experience to outcome without a lot of awareness of the pieces in between. And so if we can just slow down for ourselves and for others, we can really facilitate more productive mental processes. Here's an example. Let's say I called a brainstorming meeting, and I'm walking down the hall, and the other 3 people are already in the room because I can hear them talking. And I get to the room, and the conversation stops. And I feel a little discomfort about that. And I sit down, and in my head, I make a story. And that story is that they were gossiping about me. And they abruptly stopped talking when I walked into the room. And of course, it's a simple story. They are villains. They're bad people because they were gossiping, and I'm a helpless victim, innocent, helpless victim. And if that's my story, then my choice is likely going to be, I'm going to protect myself and keep them at arm's length. And so the action might be that I now conduct a very rigid and very proper meeting that's intended to be about brainstorming. And the outcome, as we all know, from that kind of brainstorming meeting is not much. So it's more of a brain drizzle than anything else. Now, if someone were working with me to rewind my story, they might ask, they would have listened to me. They might say, yes, that could certainly be one explanation of what happened. Are there other possible explanations? What other possible explanations are there? And it would take me a moment because I'm committed to my gossip story here. So the listener really needs to be silent. If they jump in and try to save me, I won't get anywhere. But when they're silent, something else can emerge. And so what might emerge is, well, maybe they just happened to finish their conversation at the same time I walked into the room. Okay, so that's one option. What else? And what else is like my favorite question. So I might get to the point where I say, well, it could be that they were really engaged around this brainstorming meeting. And so when I walked in, they stopped their conversation because they wanted to get right to work. And actually, maybe it was even more a sort of sign of respect that we should get right to work. And so now if that's my story, I'll make a different choice. Now my choice is to fully engage. And the action that comes out into the real world is to have a meeting that is very interactive and very free-flowing and bouncing ideas off each other without a lot of judgment. And the outcome of that is a much more productive brainstorming meeting. So I want to share that reframing the experience, rewinding this story really does allow for many more productive behaviors and outcomes in the workplace. These are just some things that I found helpful in the rewinding. A hopeful statement: neurons that fire together wire together. Common saying. But if we change our stories and our choices and our actions, those neurons will tend to wire together, so it becomes more of a habit. So that's, I think, a very positive statement about what can happen in our workplaces. Perhaps the most important equation I've ever learned in my life, and I use this one a lot with myself and with other people, is that a stimulus plus an interpretation equals an emotion. And so if you don't like the emotion you're feeling, you have to change either the stimulus or the interpretation. And the stimulus is often hard to change. So we have to change our interpretations, which really is about changing our stories. I just wanted to give you some examples of self-reflection questions that I might ask when we're doing a reframing or a rewinding. There are tons of these questions, but notice that they're open-ended. What do you know for sure? What are other possible explanations? What can you do to add value? What would great look like right now? The most important thing of all of this is that we're doing this because we actually care about people and their growth. Transformation only happens when people realize you're doing what you're doing out of caring and not because you want something. So in this process, we actually really end up changing each other. All right, so I promised workplace drama. I jotted down sort of a non-exhaustive list of workplace drama that just popped into my head, and I kind of organized it based on some commonalities between those things. We really only have time to deal with one as an example. So everybody, I'm sure, deals with complaining and venting at some point in their groups. So let's focus on that one. So we're gonna talk about it when you have time to sit down and have a conversation, and when you have to deal with it in the moment. So venting and complaining I see as very similar. Venting has sort of a more face-forward emotion, face-forward maybe anger associated with it. But both of them are fundamentally about judging. And it is neurologically not possible to judge and reflect at the same time. And if you can't reflect, you can't support someone or support a project, you can't serve, you can't add value. Self-reflection is all about accountability. Venting is like an ego trick to avoid that self-reflection. What's different about venting and complaining is that I think venting tends to be more about feelings and complaining tends to be more about mindset. So people say venting's a feeling. It's not. It's a dysfunctional behavior. It's a transient victim mindset. People vent to keep certain feelings alive. And so the way to deal with that is to help with the sharing in a positive way of those feelings. And the way you'll know it's feelings is if you ask the person. So for example, somebody comes and they're venting about a colleague, and you ask that person, what could you do to be supportive of that person? And they'll come up with an answer. I could do such and such. But if it's followed by the phrase, but I shouldn't have to, you know that is a red flag that it's about feelings. And what you want to do really is explore the feelings that are going on inside them around this. Complaining, on the other hand, we all have had that person that shows up at 3 o'clock every Tuesday at our door complaining about something. Complaining doesn't have that sort of same emotional charge, but it has that same judgment mindset. And so we gotta help the person get out of judgment. And so what I often do is try to make that into a question, turn those complaints into a question. I'll even ask, it sounds like you're trying to ask me a question in here. Is there a question that you're trying to ask? And when they come to a question, that's when we can actually have a good conversation and do some rewinding and some reframing of what's going on. I think I said earlier, as managers, we can have sort of an automatic negative response to venting and complaining, but I like to look at it in this way. People have a natural instinct to have an impact in the world. I believe that, at least. And so when they abdicate, or if they abdicate that instinct to have a natural impact, they'll disengage and they'll feel bad. And venting is part of the way of trying to deal with those feelings, because now they've become powerless. And we need to not collude with their powerlessness. What we need to do as managers, what I need to do as a manager, is really help them regain their power. That's what's going to help them be happier, and that's what's going to help them be more productive. Now, you can't always do this through a conversation. Sometimes things happen in the moment. So I'm going to share a story with you about venting that was shared with me by a colleague that I think is a marvelous story. So I hope you'll get something out of this. So in this story, there is a pre-op nurse, and she enters the pre-op, approaches a patient on a stretcher, says, hello, Mrs. Smith. I'm going to be your pre-op nurse. I'm going to be here getting you ready, and I'm going to be in the OR with you as well. She looks at the patient's bracelet. The name is right. The date of birth is right. And so she opens up the computer, brings up the screen with the patient's records, and said, so Mrs. Smith, you're here today for a hysterectomy. And Mrs. Smith goes pale and in a shaky voice says, no, I'm here for rhinoplasty. And the nurse gets a little shaken and she says, "Is your doctor Dr. Estock?" And now, much more agitated, the patient says, "No, my doctor is Dr. Jones. You know, maybe I should get up. Maybe I should leave." And the nurse says, "No, no, no, I'm going to go get somebody." And she takes off down the hall towards intake because she is going to give somebody in intake a piece of her mind. But her supervisor happens to be in the hall. And so she stops to talk to her nursing supervisor and really just lets the nursing supervisor have it. "I have this patient. She's here for rhinoplasty, but the records say she's here for a hysterectomy. She's freaking out about this. Intake always gets this stuff wrong. I'm always dealing with it. I'm going to get blamed." And the supervisor takes a deep breath and says, "If you were great right now, what would great look like?" And it stops the nurse in her tracks. And she takes a moment, and the supervisor provides that silence because something needs to arise. And the nurse says, "Well, I would go back into the room. I would apologize to Mrs. Smith on behalf of the hospital. I would tell her that I was going to do everything in my power to make sure that everything was right for her in this operation, and I was going to be there the whole time. I'd then turn the monitor to her, and I would line by line go through and correct everything in her chart while she watched, and she could affirm to me every line I changed was correct. Then I'd go get her doctor, and I'd have him come out and talk to her to make sure that she knew that he was also aligned with what was going to happen and that everything was going to be okay." And the nursing supervisor said, "That is great." So what happened there? So what happened is that nurse came down the hall, headed towards intake with a mindset of, "I'm a victim here. Everything's broken. I'm going to get blamed. Everything's black and white. I can't fix everything, so I can't fix anything." And full of judgment. And what the supervisor did was really flip the judgment into impact, flip the disengagement into engagement with a powerful question. And the wonderful thing about this is that people who are in judgment have a vision of greatness. They know exactly what it looks like because that's what they're using to judge against. And so we can use our visions, our judgments, our visions of greatness, either to judge, or we can use them as a call to action. And that's what this supervisor did, is flip it from a judgment to a call to action. And so we think that engagement is the result of circumstances in the organization, but it is actually much more highly correlated to that self-reflection. And what happened in this case is the supervisor got centered, asked a powerful question, triggered a bit of higher consciousness, and then what we didn't know in the story, but what happened very shortly after, is the supervisor checked in on the nurse to express caring and let her know she was on the journey with her. So as we wrap up today, we've talked about the right side of that cycle. We've talked about the active listening and rewind and reframe. And if we continued, we talk about how people can individually get more self-reflective. And we would start talking about how we ourselves and our employees go from bringing our whole self to work to bringing our most evolved selves to work. And what I've seen in my work is, if that cycle is working and people are getting more self-reflective and I am getting more self-reflective, the left side of that will also start as a group to become more self-reflective, and you'll have employees that push boundaries and manage through discomfort, and they start building trust and sharing and genuineness, and they understand the impact of their words, and they become empathic listeners for each other. And people are drawn to this over time. So it happens naturally once it gets started because they're just much more satisfying experiences. So in summary, my counterintuitive summary is we've talked about managing moods and attention to increase productivity. We've talked about increasing productivity by simply slowing down and actively listening to people. And we've talked about facilitating good mental processes to increase productivity. It's really all about catalyzing people to be their best selves. And so the most counterintuitive thing I'm going to say right now is we actually do all this for the person and not for the productivity. The productivity is merely a byproduct. So thank you for taking time to listen to me today.
Thanks for that wonderful presentation, Mark, on counterintuitive productivity. So we have time for 2 to 3 questions. And Mark, the first question I want to ask is, how can someone domesticate or cultivate this type of laboratory training?
This sort of laboratory around, so I think, so I'm going to kind of take the 3 parts individually. So in terms of mood and whether we're in our task positive network or our default mode network, I think we can talk to people sort of directly about this is how the mind works, and really encourage them to make the switch back and forth, because we all have creative work and we all have, you know, that sort of knock it out, implement it work, and help them understand when you move between, you know, what are the symptoms that you really need to move to your other network. And people are pretty, in my experience, people are pretty receptive to that. People may want to know the studies behind it, but there are. And so they're pretty receptive to that. And they all have sort of an intuitive understanding that kind of shift goes on within them. And when they really resist it, it becomes a problem. In terms of the active listening, there will be some people in your organizations that are better at that than others. But I guess the way I've dealt with it is try to mirror it. So I myself have tried to become the best active listener I can be, and I still have a long way to go, but I'm always working on it. I'm always working on getting better. And if I model that, what I find is that people respond to it, and people themselves start to model it as well. I don't know if that's an answer. I hope that's an adequate answer to the question. And if I'm glad to answer that offline in more detail.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, so one other question we got, Mark, was how long does the self-preparation process take for you? Is it seconds? Is it minutes?
It's minutes. So when I first, I did not do that my entire career. That was a learning over time. But when I first started that, it took me maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Nowadays, it takes me a few minutes to devote that and kind of get myself into the right mindset. And it really depends on the particular meeting. So a meeting that I'm concerned might be more contentious, I'll spend more time. So instead of 2 or 3 minutes, I might spend 5 or 7 minutes getting ready for that meeting, just to get myself into the right space, because I know that if I'm not in the right space, it won't be a productive meeting. Because if I can't really truly hear what that person is saying to a degree that they say that they've been totally heard and totally understood, we're not going to get anywhere.
Okay, yeah, great. I think we have time for one more question. So how do you handle increased productivity when your group is full of different personalities? And also follow up on that, when you have a bigger group, a 10 to 20 reports.
Yeah. Okay, so 2 pieces of that. So I really think that this all comes down to helping people become more self-reflective and staying on that journey ourselves as well. Because the more self-reflective we become, the more we kind of do our own work in terms of considering what other possibilities are, rewinding and reframing our stories, catching ourselves earlier on. That is honestly one-on-one work. And so that's, I think that's why people, it doesn't tend to happen as much as perhaps I'd like it to happen in organizations, because it really is one-on-one work. You can do some things with groups, but you can let people's individual personalities emerge more fully in one-on-one conversations. But because it's the self-reflection that kind of links everybody, it will work across a group, even though there are a lot of different personalities. I'm sorry, there was another part to that question. I should have written it down because I.
No, it's okay, Mark. Yeah, basically the follow-up. Also, like, how do you handle increased productivity when you have big teams? Let's say 10 to 20 direct reports.
Yeah. So I would have like 45 reports at one point. So I've had everything from 10 or 12 to 45, and 20 was not an unusual number. And I would have regular meetings with folks. It wouldn't be terribly frequent, and maybe we'd have a quarterly meeting. But people knew that they could always schedule time with me. So people that needed to really talk through things, I made myself available for that, because in my head, helping people with dealing with sort of more productive mindsets and not feeling like their energy is being drained through some sort of emotional waste was really important. That's just a fundamental belief I hold about productivity in the workplace, that if people kind of let go of all that, they become much more productive.
All right. Well, great. Thanks, Mark. So this brings us to the end of our first webinar in the 2020 ALMA webinar series. We would like to remind you that this webinar will be available on the ALMA website. On behalf of ALMA, we would like to thank Mark Kennedy for presenting today. We would also like to thank the audience for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Thanks again to Agilent and BioCare for sponsoring this webinar. For more information on the upcoming webinars, please visit the ALMA website. Our next session will be September 16th, and Jonathan Walson will be presenting on laboratory resource planning and modeling using activity-based costing. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.